are moments that vanish in the blink of an eye. Eleanor sat by the window, her hands gently wrapped around a warm cup of tea, feeling the delicate heat seep into her palms. Outside, the late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the garden, and golden leaves twirled lazily in the crisp autumn breeze. She had watched the seasons change from this very spot for years, but today, something about the way the wind carried those fragile leaves away unsettled her. She sighed, tracing small circles on the rim of her cup. How had time slipped away so quickly? It felt like just yesterday she was young, rushing through life, juggling responsibilities, planning for a future that always seemed just out of reach. There were children to raise, bills to pay, a home to manage. Days blurred into years, each one filled with endless tasks, as if checking things off a list was the measure of a life well lived. She had always thought there would be time to slow down, to savor quiet moments, to cherish the people she loved. But time had a way of playing tricks on you. It never paused, never waited for you to catch your breath. One moment, you were 20, then 30, then suddenly 76, looking back at a lifetime that had passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Eleanor lifted her cup to her lips, the tea now lukewarm, and let her gaze drift over the garden. She had planted those flowers herself decades ago, their roots growing deeper with each passing year, just as she had settled into her life. The roses still bloomed, the ivy still climbed, but she had changed. Her body was slower now, her reflection, in the mirror softer, etched with lines of laughter and sorrow. She often wondered, had she truly lived? Or had she simply been moving through time, mistaking motion for meaning? The weight of that thought pressed against her chest. It was an ache she had carried for years, but had never spoken aloud. There were regrets, of course. The late-night phone, calls she should have made, the vacations she had postponed, the times she had let anger linger longer than love. The moments she had been present in body but absent in spirit, lost in worries that, in the end, never really mattered. She wished she had known then what she knew now, that the small things were never small. That time was not infinite. That youth was not a promise, only a fleeting gift. She sighed again, softer this time, and closed her eyes. Have you ever blinked, only to realize an entire lifetime has passed? We often grasp the value of time only after it has slipped away. But is it ever too late to live differently? A question she had asked herself countless times, and yet, as she sat there, watching the world move around her, she realized something. She was still here. She still had time. Maybe she couldn't change the past. Maybe she couldn't rewind the years or rewrite the chapters that had already been written, but she could decide how the rest of her story would unfold. She could wake up tomorrow and choose to greet the day with gratitude instead of regret. She could take a walk and feel the earth beneath her feet, taste her morning coffee as if it were the first time. She could call an old friend, laugh until tears ran down her cheeks, dance in her kitchen even if her steps were slower than before. She could live, because life was not measured by the years behind her, but by the moments she still had left. Time may be relentless, but so was she, and perhaps, just perhaps, today was as good a day as any to begin again. Are the habits that shape how we age time moves forward, steady and unyielding, like the hands of a clock. But how fast or slow that clock ticks, how gracefully we age, is not merely a matter of fate. It is the result of choices, small and seemingly insignificant in the moment, yet powerful enough to shape the years ahead. Eleanor understood this now, but she hadn't always. She thought back to the habits of her younger years, to the days when sleep felt optional and self-care was an afterthought. She had spent decades running on empty, as if exhaustion were a badge of honor. Mornings began with coffee, strong and black, the first of many cups throughout the day. She often skipped breakfast, convincing herself she wasn't hungry, that she'd eat later. But later never came. And by mid-afternoon, she found herself reaching for something quick and sugary to keep going. Exercise. There had been a time long ago when she had loved to move, dancing in her 20s, long walks in her 30s. But somewhere between raising children and managing life's endless responsibilities, movement became something she squeezed in, only when convenient. And more often than not, it wasn't. At night, she would finally collapse into bed, her body aching, her mind buzzing. She stared at the ceiling, willing sleep to come, but it rarely did. The exhaustion was ever present, yet rest was elusive, and so she would reach for another cup of coffee the next morning, and the cycle would begin again. She had ignored the warnings, subtle at first, then undeniable. The dull aches in her joints, the sluggishness in her limbs, the way her body no longer felt like her own. By the time she reached 60, it wasn't just exhaustion she felt. It was something deeper, something she couldn't shake. The creeping realization that she was aging faster than she should have been. One morning, after a restless night, she had struggled just to get out of bed. Her knees protested, stiff and unyielding, and a sharp pain shot through her lower back. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, her skin pale, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. It wasn't vanity that unsettled her. It was the undeniable truth staring back at her. She had spent years wearing herself down, without ever realizing it. That was the moment something shifted. She could not turn back time, but she could change the way she moved through it. It didn't happen all at once. Change rarely does. But little by little she began to rewrite the habits that had written the years on her body. She started with the simplest thing: water. She replaced her second and third cups of coffee with a glass of water in the morning, then another in the afternoon. It was a small shift, but she felt the difference almost immediately. Her headaches became less frequent, her mind clearer. She began eating breakfast again, not something rushed and convenient, but real food. A handful of nuts, fresh, fruit, warm oatmeal. It wasn't about dieting or deprivation. It was about nourishment, about honoring her body instead of punishing it. She set a bedtime, and for the first time in years, she followed it. No more late-night television, no more scrolling through memories on her phone. Just the simple ritual of winding down. A warm cup of herbal tea, a book, the soft glow of a bedside lamp. Sleep, once a stranger, slowly became a friend again. And then, there was movement. At first, she told herself she was too old to start exercising, that the damage had already been done. But she refused to believe that lie. She did not need to run marathons, did not need to push her body to its limits. She only needed to move. So she walked. Around the block at first, then a little further each day. Some days, her knees ached, and her body resisted, but she kept going. And something remarkable happened. She felt lighter, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The aches in her joints began to fade. Her energy, once so fleeting, returned in steady waves. She woke up in the mornings feeling rested instead of weary. The clock had not stopped ticking. Time still moved forward, as it always would. But for the first time in years, Eleanor no longer felt like she was racing against it. She had learned, finally, that aging well was not about luck. It was about choice, and the choices she made today would shape the years she had left. Third, the body's warnings. Are we listening? The body is like a book. Every ache, every moment of fatigue, every forgotten name is a line written in its pages. At first, the warnings are subtle, whispered reminders in the margins of our lives. But when we fail to listen, the writing grows bolder, the sentences heavier, Until one day, we reach a chapter we never saw coming. Eleanor had ignored the early pages of that book. She remembered when the signs first appeared, small inconveniences, easy to dismiss. She would wake up in the morning feeling unrested, as if sleep had barely touched her. But it was just a bad night, she told herself. A little stiffness in her knees when she stood up, just age settling in. And the moments when she would walk into a room only to forget why she was there. It happened to everyone, didn't it? She had explanations for everything. But over time, those small discomforts wove themselves into her days like loose threads in a once perfect fabric, slowly unraveling her sense of vitality. She started feeling more tired than she should. No matter how much she slept, mornings always greeted her with an unshakable exhaustion. There was a heaviness in her limbs, a fog in her mind. She brushed it off. She was simply getting older. Then, the joint pain came. At first, it was nothing more than a dull ache in her fingers and knees, a stiffness that lingered in the mornings, but faded as the day wore on. It was easy to ignore, easy to attribute to a life well lived. But then it grew worse. Some days, her knees resisted when she tried to stand. Other days, her hands felt weaker, as if the strength that had once carried her through decades of work and care had begun slipping away. And then, there were the moments of forgetfulness, small lapses at first, just names and misplaced keys. But one afternoon, she forgot the name of a dear friend, someone she had known for years. The name dangled just out of reach, taunting her. It was as if a part of her memory had been locked away, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find the key. That was when the fear crept in. But still, she did nothing, until the day she fell. It was an ordinary afternoon. Eleanor had been in the kitchen tidying up when she decided to step outside to check the mail. She had walked down those steps thousands of times, never thinking twice about them. But as she placed her foot on the first step, a sharp pain shot through her knee, quick, unexpected. Her body wavered, and before she could steady herself, she was falling. The world tilted, the ground rushed toward her, and then, pain. She lay there for a moment, stunned, the autumn air sharp against her skin. The pain in her wrist where she had tried to break her fall pulsed in time with her racing heart. And then, an even sharper realization settled over her. Her body had been warning her for years. She just hadn't listened. It wasn't just about this fall. It was about all the times she had pushed through fatigue instead of resting. All the times she had dismissed her aching joints instead of strengthening them. All the times she had ignored what her body was trying to tell her. Sitting there on the cold ground, Eleanor knew she had a choice. She could keep pretending these signs meant nothing, hoping that she could outlast them. Or she could start listening, really listening, before her body was forced to shout again. From that day forward, she made a promise to herself. She would treat her body like the living, breathing story that it was. She would pay attention to the whispers before they became screams. She would no longer wait until pain forced her to stop. She would stop and care for herself before it was too late. Because the body is always speaking to us. The question is, are we listening? Either nurturing yourself from the inside. Out the garden in Eleanor's backyard had been there for decades, its roots stretching deep into the earth, unseen but essential. She had spent years tending to it, pruning the roses, pulling weeds, making sure the soil was rich and nourished. And in return, it had flourished year after year, season after season. But there was a time when she hadn't realized that the same care she gave to her garden should have been given to herself. For years, she had focused on the outside, how she looked, how she carried herself, how others perceived her. She had worried about wrinkles, about graying hair, about the changes in her reflection. What she hadn't understood was that real health, real vitality, was not something that could be seen in a mirror. It started deep beneath the surface, just like the roots of her beloved plants. More than just appearance. The foundation of true health, Eleanor had always thought that as long as she stayed active and ate reasonably well, she was doing enough. But as she got older, she realized that health was not just about movement or food. It was about balance, about listening to her body in ways she never had before. She had never given much thought to hormonal health, but as she aged, she began to feel its impact. Her energy levels fluctuated, her mood shifted unpredictably, and there were days when she felt exhausted for no apparent reason. It wasn't just about getting older. Her body was asking for support. So she started small. She adjusted her diet, choosing foods that worked with her body instead of against it. Less sugar, more whole foods, more leafy greens, more healthy fats, more protein that nourished her from within. Instead of depriving herself, she learned to fuel herself, and almost. Immediately, she noticed a difference. Her energy, once fleeting, began to stabilize. The fog in her mind lifted. She no longer felt like she was dragging herself through the day. It was as if her body had been waiting for her to listen. Movement, not just for the body, but for the soul. For years, Eleanor had seen exercise as something meant for the young, for those trying to stay slim or strong. But at 72, she realized it was so much more than that. She had never done yoga before. In fact, she had always found it intimidating. The slow, deliberate movements, the deep stretches, the stillness. But one day, on a whim, she signed up for a beginner's class. She felt awkward at first, unsure of her footing, hesitant in her movements. But as she followed the instructor's guidance, something incredible happened. For the first time in years, she felt connected to her body. She felt the tension release from her shoulders, the stiffness in her joints begin to ease. The deep breathing calmed her mind in a way she hadn't expected. And at the end of class, as she lay on her mat with her eyes closed, she felt a kind of peace she hadn't known she was missing. She kept going back. Week after week, she moved with more confidence, her body becoming stronger, more flexible. But it wasn't just about physical strength. It was about feeling at home in her body again. And that was something she hadn't felt in a long time. The power of stillness, listening to the body's whispers in all her years. Eleanor had never been one to sit still. She had always filled her days with tasks, with movement, with distractions. But as she got older, she began to realize that sometimes the most important thing she could do was simply pause. She started practicing breath work, noticing the way her breath moved in and out of her body, slowing it down, allowing it to guide her into a place of stillness. It was uncomfortable at first, this act of simply being, but over time, she realized that in the quiet, she could hear herself more clearly. She could feel when she needed rest, when she needed movement, when she needed nourishment. She could finally hear what her body had been trying to tell her all along. Caring for yourself is not a luxury. It's a necessity. Eleanor used to think that taking care of herself was something she could put off, something less important than the needs of everyone around her. But she knew better now. Taking care of herself was not selfish. It was not indulgent. It was essential. Because when she nurtured herself from the inside out, when she treated her body with kindness and care, everything else in her life became richer, fuller, more alive. And just like her garden, she was finally beginning to bloom again. Intimacy in old age. Don't let societal expectations define you. Love is often imagined as a fire, burning bright and fierce in youth, then slowly fading into embers as the years pass. But Eleanor had come to realize something else. The most enduring love was not the kind that roared with intensity, but the kind that glowed steadily, offering warmth and light long after the initial flames had settled. For a long time, she believed her days of intimacy were over. After her husband, Richard, passed away, Eleanor convinced herself that chapter of her life had closed. They had been married for 46 years, sharing everything, the joys of youth, the struggles of raising a family, the quiet comfort of knowing someone so deeply that words were often unnecessary. When he was gone, so too, she thought, was that part of her. She had absorbed what the world had told her, that intimacy belonged to the young, that desire had an expiration date, that past a certain age, love became something purely emotional, stripped of physical longing, and for a while she accepted it, until she met Daniel. Love after loss. A new beginning. It wasn't supposed to happen, or at least she hadn't expected it. They met at a community book club, of all places, two people drawn together by a shared love of old literature. At first, their conversations were nothing more than friendly exchanges about the books they read, but over time, something deeper unfolded between them, something Eleanor hadn't dared to consider. Attraction. It was subtle at first. The way his eyes lingered a moment longer when she spoke, the warmth in his voice when he said her name, a brush of hands while passing a book, a laugh shared over coffee. And then, one evening, as they walked together through the park, he reached for her hand. Eleanor's instinct was to pull away, not because she didn't want it, but because she was afraid. Afraid of what it meant, afraid of what people might think, afraid of allowing herself to believe that love and intimacy could exist for her again. But as his fingers gently intertwined with hers, she realized something. The only thing holding her back was herself. Redefining intimacy. Its more than just physical society had led her to believe that intimacy was purely physical, that it belonged to the young and faded with age. But standing there, holding Daniel's hand, she understood how wrong that was. Intimacy was not just about bodies. It was about connection, about being seen, truly seen, by another person. About feeling wanted, not in the way youth demands, but in the way experience cherishes. As their relationship deepened, Eleanor rediscovered parts of herself she had long buried. The way anticipation made her heart race, the pleasure of touch, not rushed or expected, but given and received with tenderness, the joy of laughter shared in the quiet moments of the night. And she realized that nothing about intimacy had disappeared with age. It had simply changed. It was no longer about proving anything, no longer tangled in insecurities or expectations. There was no rush, no pressure, only presence. She thought back to the countless women she had known who had resigned themselves to loneliness, not because they wanted to, but because they had been told that passion belonged in the past. But why? Why should love, why should desire have a deadline? Breaking free from the myths of aging Eleanor had once been one of those women, believing that at a certain age, intimacy simply faded away. But now she knew better. Passion does not have an expiration date. Love does not vanish with the passing of time. The ability to connect, to touch, to crave, and to be craved, it does not disappear. The only thing that changes is the way we allow ourselves to experience it. For Eleanor, the lesson was clear. Closeness has no age. Love has no limit. And intimacy, that is something we never outgrow, unless we choose to. They joy tu duai velau. Our life moves forward like a river, carving its path through time, shaping everything it touches. Some people fight against the current, resisting change, trying desperately to hold on to what once was. Others learn to move with it, letting it carry them forward, embracing what each new season of life brings. For a long time, Eleanor had been one of those who resisted. She had absorbed the quiet messages society whispered about aging, the idea that growing older was a slow unraveling, a gradual loss of everything that made life meaningful. She believed, as many did, that once you reached a certain age, change became impossible, that no matter what you did, things would only decline. She told herself that certain joys belonged to the young, that passion faded, that adventure was for someone else. Her best days, she thought, were behind her. And so she lived as if that were true. She began saying no to things that once excited her. She let go of dreams she had yet to fulfill, telling herself it was too late. She watched the world shrink around her, her days growing quieter, smaller, as if life itself had begun closing in. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but there was something missing, something she couldn't quite name. Then, one afternoon, she met Marie. Marie was 80 years old, but carried herself with the ease and confidence of someone decades younger. She walked with purpose, her steps light, her laughter rich and full. There was a brightness in her eyes, an energy in the way she spoke, as if she was still discovering the world. They met through a mutual friend at a small cafe, and as they talked, Eleanor found herself drawn in by Marie's stories, of how she had learned to paint at 70, of the solo trip she had taken to Italy at 75, of the dance class she had joined just last year. At some point, Eleanor, unable to hide her curiosity, asked, "But how? How do you still do all of this?" Marie smiled, as if she had been waiting for that question. "Because I never told myself I couldn't." Eleanor let those words settle inside her. She had spent so much time believing that aging meant becoming less capable, less adventurous, less alive. But Marie had shown her something different. She hadn't stayed young because she had been lucky, or because she had been given some gift that others hadn't. The difference was in her mindset. She didn't see time as something to fear. She saw it as something to use. Eleanor began to wonder how much of her own experience had been shaped by what she had told herself. She had believed she was too old to try new things, so she hadn't. She had believed her body would only grow weaker, so she let it. She had believed the world would shrink around her, and so it did. But what if she had been wrong? What if she could still learn? What if her body, while different than it once was, could still be strong and capable? What if there were still adventures waiting for her? She decided she no longer wanted to resist the river. She wanted to move with it. She started small. She signed up for a painting class, something she had always wanted to do, but had convinced herself was for younger women with steadier hands. She went on morning walks, not because she had to exercise, but because she wanted to feel the world, wake up around her. She let herself laugh more, let herself feel beautiful, not in spite of her wrinkles but because of them, and something remarkable happened. She felt lighter, not just in her body, but in her spirit. The world, which had seemed to be closing in, was suddenly open again. There was no rush, no urgency to reclaim youth. There was only the quiet, steady realization that life was still hers to live. Aging was never about fading away. It was about shifting, transforming, becoming. It was never about how many years were behind her. It was always about how she chose to live the ones ahead. Sahmo. Lin hot va tichung, biquiet kua toijahan. Eleanor had always admired the great oak tree that stood at the edge of her garden. It had been there for longer than she could remember, its roots deep in the earth, its branches stretching toward the sky. She had watched it endure countless storms, winds that bent its limbs, rains that soaked its bark, winters that weighed it down with snow. And yet, year after year, it remained standing, not because it had resisted the forces around it, but because it had learned to bend without breaking. She had never thought much about that lesson until she realized how much she had been resisting change in her own life. For years, Eleanor had told herself that she didn't need to keep up with the world as it evolved. She dismissed new technology, laughed off the idea of social media, and refused to learn how to use a smartphone. When her grandchildren would try to show her, she would shake her head saying, "That's for young people." She had spent decades doing just fine without it, and she saw no reason to start now. But over time, she began to feel the distance growing. Her children and grandchildren lived in different cities, and phone calls became less frequent. Conversations during family gatherings were filled with references to things she didn't understand: apps, video calls, online news. She watched as they shared photos instantly, stayed connected with friends across the world, and communicated in ways that seemed almost foreign to her. She told herself it didn't matter, but deep down, she felt it. The slow, creeping sense of being left behind. One evening, as she sat alone in her quiet house, she looked at an old photo on her mantelpiece, a picture of her granddaughter, Lily, as a little girl, laughing in the summer sun. It had been months since Eleanor had last seen her, and suddenly, the ache of missing her became unbearable. That night, she made a decision. The next morning, she asked her son to help her set up a smartphone. She was hesitant, even embarrassed, but she pushed past it. At first, it felt impossible. So many buttons, so many unfamiliar icons. But little by little, she learned. She learned how to send messages, how to make video calls, how to scroll through pictures her family shared. The first time she saw Lily's face on a video call, her heart swelled. It wasn't the same as holding her in person, but it was something. It was connection. And something inside Eleanor shifted. She realized that learning something new, adapting, didn't mean she was losing herself. It meant she was growing. It meant she was staying open to the world instead of closing herself off from it. For too long, she had seen change as something to fear, as a sign that she was leaving behind the familiar comforts of the past. But in truth, change was just another form of life moving forward. She thought of the oak tree again, how it did not resist the wind but swayed with it, adjusting, adapting, surviving. Eleanor began to wonder, what else had she been resisting? She started saying yes more often. Yes to new experiences. Yes to unfamiliar conversations. Yes to stepping outside of her comfort zone. She took a painting class, even though she had never held a brush in her life. She joined a local book club, even though she wasn't sure if she had anything interesting to say. She let herself be a beginner again, and with every small act of adaptation, she felt more alive. She understood now that aging did not mean becoming rigid. It did not mean clinging to the past so tightly that there was no room for the present. The happiest people, the ones who aged with grace and joy, were the ones who learned to move with life instead of against it. Eleanor was no longer afraid of change, because she had learned that the key to a fulfilling life was not in staying the same, it was in being willing to grow. Fee 8. Kong Bao Gio, L'acqua Muone Eleanor sat in her garden, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the roses she had tended for years. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming lavender. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth on her skin, listening to the distant rustling of leaves. This garden had seen every chapter of her life, seasons of love, loss, change, and quiet resilience. She had once believed that time was something to be feared, a relentless force that took more than it gave. But now, sitting here, she understood the truth. Time had never been her enemy. It had simply been moving forward, just as she had been. And the real question was never about how much time remained. It was about what she would do with the time she had. For years, she had thought she had missed her chance. There were things she wished she had done sooner, moments she wished she had savored more deeply. She had spent too long believing that the best of life was behind her, that certain joys belonged only to the young. But she knew better now. Regret, she realized, was not about what had passed. It was about refusing to begin again. She looked down at her hands that had carried children, prepared meals, wiped away tears, and held the hands of those she had loved. These hands had done so much, and yet they were still capable. Her heart had known loss, but it was still capable of love. Her body had grown older, but it was still capable of movement. She smiled to herself, thinking of all the ways she had surprised herself in these later years. She had learned to use a smartphone, reconnecting with family in a way she never thought possible. She had taken a painting class, discovering a creativity she had never given herself permission to explore. She had learned to slow down, to breathe deeply, to appreciate the stillness in ways she never had before. And perhaps most importantly, she had learned that it was never too late to feel alive. She had seen too many people let time slip through their fingers, waiting for the right moment to change, to try, to live. But the right moment was never in the past. It was never some distant, unreachable point in the future. The right moment was always now. She thought of the oak tree standing tall at the edge of her garden, its roots deep, its branches stretched toward the sky. It had weathered countless storms, adapted to the seasons, continued to grow no matter what. It did not dwell on the years it had lost. It only focused on the life still, left to live. Eleanor wanted to be like that. She took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. She did not wish to go back in time. She did not wish to be younger. She only wished to make the most of the years she had, because time, she had learned, could not be rewound. But it could be embraced. She whispered softly to herself as if speaking, "To the wind, to the trees, to the years ahead. The past is behind me, but life is still in front of me. I cannot change yesterday, but I can choose today. It is never too late." And with that, she stood up, stretching her arms toward the sky, feeling the steady, powerful beat of her own heart. It was not too late. It had never been too late, and for however many days she had left, she would not just exist, she would live.